Dear Ambassador, dear Ian, distinguished participants, greet you on behalf of the Union and Commodity Exchanges of Turkey, namely TOBB. TOBB is the umbrella of the Turkish business community in Turkey. We represent 0.8 million companies of the economy and all sizes. I would like to thank for organizing this event only for the donors conference. As you all know, on the 6th of February, the nation woke up by the of 2 earthquakes. Of these earthquakes were 7 and 7.6 respectively. These earthquakes hit 11 in the southeastern region of Turkey and more than 50,000 people. The earthquakes affected some people in these cities. More than 16% of our total population. The number collapsed and heavily damaged in these regions are around 30,000. 0.6 million people lost their home. These earthquakes were followed by 13,000 aftershocks of earthquakes. The humanitarian region is among the economically significant regions of the Turkey. Important region in terms of both industrial and agricultural sectors. Numbers, the region accounts for 9% of its total national income, 8.5% of its exports, 14% of its agricultural production. According to the damage is calculated to be around $100 billion. It's more than 10% of Turkish GDP of 2002. We deeply regret the region has directly affected 43 chambers. Unfortunately, we have lost our colleagues from several local chambers, including one president, board member, 2 secretary generals, deputy secretary general, and moreover, more than buildings have been damaged. Around 200 companies have been negatively affected by this disaster. In this, our priority to the supply of emergency equipment and all emergency supplies, including water, fuel equipment, blankets, and hygiene and other delivery of these goods to the region. So far, as chamber network, we have provided necessary equipment by 6 and 7 ferry boats, 4,000 trucks with tents, 1,500 living to the region, 140 mobile kitchens, 51 rescue machine, and in the next stage, we are houses in the region for the need. TOBB has been a donation campaign for rebuilding campaign. Also has launched the following. My supplier is region. This is parts of industry, and also supplier is from the earthquake region. Agricultural goods as well. Organize positive discrimination in a commerce platforms for the company. Another, they do not pay any for the goods they sell. Also, and chambers, other regions have political and mentoring support for the chambers and in the region. We rebuilt the region, provision to the victims and rehabilitation and social life in the region is vital. We also hope that Turkey will gain pace in re-energizing the relationship, possibly by the verification of the custom union and facilitate adaptation to the Green Deal digital agenda. Once again, thank you for the solidarity of the international community, and thank you very much for attention. Sorry about the connection.
Ayhan Bey, thank you very much. We also thank to TOP for its contribution to our GMF TOP Fellowship. Ian Lesser is with us now, and over to you, Ian.
Ceylan, thank you very, very much. And my sincere apologies. I mean, as you may, some of you in Brussels will certainly know, there's a European Council summit today, and it's not easy to move around. And so I very much apologize for being a few minutes late to start. But Vice President Zeytinoğlu, thank you very, very much to you and also to TOBB for being with us today, but also for your longtime support for our work on Turkey in a European and transatlantic context. We're very grateful for that. I won't hold us up on our conversation today, which is an extraordinarily important one for all the reasons that you've just noted, given the tragic development of the earthquake in Turkey and its aftermath. I did also just want to say on behalf of GMF how delighted we are to have with us today Ambassador Faruk Kaymakcı, old friend of GMF. Welcome to Brussels still, if I can say, Faruk Bey, and also Dr. Michael Koehler, who is Deputy Director General of the Directorate-General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations, DG ECHO at the European Commission. Also, all longtime friends of GMF, and just the right people to have with us today for this conversation. So thank you very much. Let me turn it back to you, Ceylan, to moderate this conversation, and we look forward to that. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ian. Would you also like to add a couple of words on the GMF Hope Fund for Turkey, because this is something GMF is doing for the people affected in Turkey?
Yes, I mean, this is, we can say a little bit more about this perhaps even at the end, but, GMF has a facility called its Hope Fund, which has been focused for the last year or so actually on Ukraine, but we decided also to open up this facility for contributions to support relief efforts in Turkey, and we have a very active member of our Marshall Memorial Fellows alumni in Turkey who is leading that effort, and perhaps maybe at the end, Ceylan, you could say just a little bit more about how people can help with that, but we're delighted to be able to do that under these conditions. So thank you. Ceylan, back to you.
Will do, Ian. Thank you. And let me take it from here and allow me to introduce you to our speakers. Ambassador Faruk Kaymakcı is the permanent delegate of the Republic of Turkey to the European Union. And also we have Dr. Michael Koehler. He is the Deputy Director-General of the Directorate-General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations of the European Commission. And apparently we now have 40 minutes for our discussion, and we are hoping to use the first half for the speaker deliberations and the second half for the questions and answers session. And by now, I'm pretty sure that most of us are familiar with the Zoom procedures, but let me just remind you that you can submit your comments and questions through the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. The chat function is disabled, and you will not have access to your cameras and microphones because this is a webinar. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to you, Ambassador Kaymakcı.
Thank you very much Ceylan Hanım. Dear Ian, sevgili Ayhan Bey, dear my professor Michael Koehler from the College of Europe, but of course today he is with us with his capacity as Deputy DG ECHO, and I would like to greet all of you from Brussels, from the Turkish mission to the EU. Since we have a limited time, I will try to make some points. Maybe they may not be in good order, but these are some of the points that I wanted to share with you to discuss with you. First, let me start again by remembering the victims of the earthquakes. And I will not go into the figures, but Ayhan Bey mentioned them a lot, mentioned them in these figures, more or less, but the magnitude of this earthquake is unprecedented in this, for the century, for Turkey and I think for Europe. So this is a huge magnitude. But also let me start by wishing happy Ramadan to those who are celebrating. And also let me congratulate the EU and Michael and his colleagues on successfully organizing not only International Donors Conference, but also European Humanitarian Forum, which was, I think, a bit shadowed because of our IDC meeting. Sorry, Michael, for this, but the dates, so we had to fix. I mentioned, of course, the numbers of the earthquakes were shared by Ayhan Bey, so I'm not going to repeat them, but maybe we can discuss if there is any time. The impacts of the earthquakes, both in Turkey and in Syria, in terms of regional and international implications about migration and also maybe about some rapprochement between some countries, but this is something that we can discuss later on. So we are really grateful to the international community, but especially the EU, for being generous during the IDC. My points about the IDC, very basic points. First, I think it was organized quite fast, and it was organized quite well. And I'm really thankful to our colleagues of the European Commission and the DG NEAR. And again, this conference, as Commissioner Varela mentioned, is not an end itself, but it's the beginning. So we made some pledges to Turkey and to Syria, but hopefully this is not the end, but it's the beginning, because we need to coordinate, we need to work together for the recovery and for the reconstruction, and that might take some more time. And we hope that this will not be the end, but it will be the beginning of a process. So in terms of the figures, the amount, more or less for Turkey, we have now 1.6 billion euros in total. And out of these 1.6 billion euros, we have 1.8 billion euros in the form of grants. And then we have 4.3 billion euros in the form of soft loans. So this is, I think, it's a quite reasonable number. And when we look at this number, of course, we do appreciate any support from any donor. But when we look at the figure, we see that 3.3 billion euros come from the EU, basically from the EU system, EU member state. So this makes us feel that our European family is with us, and they support it generously, and we do appreciate this, and I think it is important to underline. But of course, individual donor countries such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and Japan and US and some others, they have also contributed a lot. But when we look at the bulk of the aid, the support, mostly this is from the European family to a European nation in Turkey. And this figure has been possible, I think, despite the fact that COVID pandemic and the Russian war against Ukraine created a lot of financial difficulties for all of us. So COVID, I don't know whether we have measured the cost of COVID pandemic so far, but when we look at also the Russian war against Ukraine, I read a report this morning that the destruction measured at the level of $340 billion in Ukraine. And of course, we have already $104 billion of damage because of the earthquake in Turkey. So when you look at this difficult, financial conditions now. So this assistance, financial assistance, is quite meaningful and it's quite helpful, I would say. And how are we going to run these funds from now on? Of course, in Turkey, we have created what we call Disaster Reconstruction Fund. This is some sort of repository fund where we will be keeping the record of all the financial assistance coming from everywhere, so that the international community as well as the EU can see easily, how much finance is involved and what are the major what the major projects are, and how this will be spent, where it will be spent. And I think this will help us to follow and coordinate funding and the projects. So we believe that this fund will be useful to all of us, and it is operational and it was created before the IDC, and it is now helping us. And when it comes to European funding, when I say European, mostly it's the EU, but of course we have bilateral channels with EU member states. But as far as the EU funding is concerned, so it seems that we will be using the IPA channels, Instrument for Pre-Accession channel. We will be using IPART, again, Rural Development and Agriculture channel. We will be using Turkey Investment Platform, European Solidarity Fund, and we will also use civil society program directly from, maybe some part directly from the EU delegation in Ankara, but also some joint civil society projects through the Directorate for EU Affairs in Ankara. But also some of the funding will be probably used in Turkey's financial contributions to some of the EU programs that we are contributing. So more or less, but of course the details will come up. So we are discussing now with our EU colleagues how we can use this funding in the most efficient, in the most productive way. This earthquake and the IDC that we had, I think it has created some de-escalation. For example, between Turkey and Greece. And I can say that it has also created some solidarity and strong solidarity between the EU and Turkey, because EU civil protection mechanism was the fastest and the most comprehensive actor in providing rescue and search operations, but also providing humanitarian aid. And but also we have seen from many countries, but mostly from European countries, rescue teams coming, Greeks, Armenians, and Germans. I don't want to mention all of them, but we had more than, I think, 20 European countries acting immediately on the first day and providing help. I think this has created also a feeling of belonging more to the European family in the Turkish society. But also we have seen many volunteers. The volunteers have not been noticed very much during this crisis, but we have seen many volunteers from many European countries going to Turkey and helping, people in tents, in health, and in other areas. But also volunteers are organizing fundraising in many European countries. Even in Brussels, in my first 2-3 weeks, I got invitations from at least 5-10, NGOs, local NGOs, mixed NGOs, not necessarily Turkish, and they are organizing concerts, events, exhibitions about the earthquake, and they are, they are really giving support. I think this is also very important. People-to-people contact is there. Of course, we are, shocked because of the earthquake. We lost many lives. We lost many buildings, many infrastructure. But now there is again an opportunity to build better, to build maybe smarter, greener, and digital, as Ayhan Bey mentioned. I think this can also, help us in terms of accelerating, twin transformation in Turkey, green transformation, but also digital transformation. So I think these are some of the points that I wanted to make now, in order to, to allow Michael also to make his points, but also maybe get some comments and questions from other friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kaymakcı. I will now leave the floor to Dr. Koehler.
Thank you very much. Teşekkür ederim, Ceylan Hanım. And also a great hello to Ayhan Bey, to Dr. Ian Lesser, of course, to my very good friend, Faruk Kaymakcı. And Faruk, you made my life very easy because contrary to our usually very juicy and interesting debates, there's absolutely nothing that you said I wouldn't fully agree with. I don't know, so maybe this disaster creates such a commonality of minds. But also the figures that Ayhan Bey mentioned are, of course, the figures that at this moment in time, I think are a common basis for all international aid, and they are breathtaking. I mean, I'm a historian by training, so I learned that the latest earthquake of that size in that region of the world dates back basically 1,000 years. In 1114, in the Crusaders period, you had in the area of Gaziantep and Kahramanmaraş, which still had another name at the time, an earthquake of that magnitude. Between 13,000, 11,000, 13,000 aftershocks, some of them very, very heavy. 2.3 million displaced, 14 million people affected, almost 300,000 houses destroyed, and that's only in Turkey. Obviously, the only thing, Faruk, that I could really add to what you said is that we should not forget also about the Syrian dimension of the earthquake. Yes, the center of the earthquake was, of course, in Turkey, but the shock could be felt basically in large parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. And definitely, we have damage down to Homs and Hama in Syria, and in particular, of course, in the northwest. And as you all know, this is the region, both the south of Turkey, just as much as the northwest of Syria, that is already suffering a lot, where you have millions of displaced people. In the northwest of Syria, for example, about 4.6 million people who are internally displaced as a consequence of the conflict in Syria. So in many regards, it has hit those people who are already in a way suffering from man-made disasters, sometimes also from natural disasters. There are lots of floods. That's the same region in the northwest of Syria where we had recently a cholera outbreak, for example. So people who are really suffering already, who really depend already on international assistance. And the only good aspect in all this is that because of this fact, both in the south of Turkey, as just as much as in the northwest of Syria, you have a functioning aid infrastructure. So you had not only relief services, Turkish relief services like AFAD, for example, but also an international relief infrastructure, both for emergency relief, but also for humanitarian aid. And all these structures, all these funds, all these projects, all these experts were immediately activated to help the Turkish and the Syrian and also other victims of the disaster. We heard the figures about Turkey, but in Syria, where of course the statistics are not as reliable and where the international needs assessment of course is not as much advanced, we know that we have at least also 6,000 dead. And we certainly have a couple of tens of thousands of people who are now homeless, who are internally displaced. And that in a region, as I said, which even before the earthquake had 4.6 million people who are internally displaced, which means that they're living in tents, for example. They're living in makeshift shelters and forms of housing. And therefore, it is very, very important that this conference on the 6th of February, 6th of March, exactly 6 weeks after the disaster, dealt with both victims, the victims in Turkey, but also the victims in Syria. Now, if you if you look a little bit at the outcome of the conference, and again, I can very happily join my voice to what Faruk said about his analysis. I think there are a couple of things that are worth highlighting. On the one hand, it's indeed a tremendous international effort. I'm working on crisis and on humanitarian suffering in about 80 countries in the world, and therefore I'm quite keenly aware how difficult it is to harness the resources, to find the money for that. And that in this situation, indeed, 7 billion euros were collected in different forms of finance for all kinds of aid that is now necessary after the earthquake is a very, very noteworthy international effort. And I would like to underline again, as Ambassador Kaymakcı, that it is an effort by many, many countries, but indeed the European footprint is astoundingly important. If you look at the breakdown of the funds that were pledged for both Turkey and for Syria, you see that the lion's share by far comes from the European Commission and its member states. There is also, and I find this extremely positive, a very noteworthy Arab contribution. If you count together the contributions of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and so forth, you come to the second biggest chunk of contributors, whereas other traditional contributors, and I don't mean this in any way as a criticism, such as, for example, the United States and the United Kingdom, but also some others like, for example, Japan or Korea, made an effort. They were there, but with relatively modest amounts in comparison to this European and Arab effort. And I would see a political message in that, not a negative message from the United States, but rather a message that the Europeans and the Arabs have understood that this is in their region, that it is about their neighbor countries, and that, of course, they are in a particular obligation here to show solidarity with the victims of the disaster, but also, of course, with the reconstruction effort that is necessary. And mentioning reconstruction leads us also a little bit into the difficulty of this conference. The title was Together for the People in Turkey and Syria, International Donors Conference. But you may remember that when the conference was announced, it had a slightly different working title. It was called International Reconstruction Conference. And there, of course, we see a little bit of the complexity, because as you know, that obviously, whereas reconstruction is necessary, there are different framework conditions and different political backgrounds. With respect to Turkey, obviously, reconstruction is something where the international community will help. But this is much more difficult in the case of Turkey. In the case of Syria. In the case of Syria, we have a very complex governance situation. It's a country that is ruled out of Damascus by a government that is, let's say, not recognized by large parts of the international community, including by the European Union. Secondly, you have the northwest of Syria, where you have different forms of governance, but at least it's not the government in Damascus. Supplying assistance into the northwest of Syria is possible only through Turkey, and obviously extremely difficult in a situation where on the one hand you have a difficult legal situation, and at the same time logistically it was very difficult, because Hatay, the main approach if you want to go to the region north of Aleppo in Syria, was of course very much affected, and the roads and the border crossing points like Bab el-Hawa in the beginning of the days after the earthquake were very much affected, and the border crossing was closed. So mobilizing assistance was more difficult. And also when it comes to the availability of funding, the pledges for the Syria part of the conference are very significant. They are definitely smaller than the pledges made for the Turkish part. But the main difference really is that the Syria pledges basically cover two things. One is humanitarian aid, and the other thing is early recovery. What is not in there is reconstruction aid, and what is not in there are bank loans, obviously. The entire pledge of 4.6 billion euros of soft loans that Ambassador Kaymakcı mentioned and that come mainly again from European banks, such as the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, such as the Council of Europe Bank, such as the European Investment Bank, and only smaller parts come from the World Bank and from the Islamic Development Bank. The entirety of this money goes, of course, into the reconstruction of Turkey. But there are no credit operations, not even soft loan operations in Syria. That means that I think it is very, very important, both for the Turkish part of the operation, as just as much as for the Syrian part of the operation, to distinguish between the forms of finance that were pledged, because every form of finance has different calendars, different implementation conditionalities, and requires a different coordination mechanism. But there needs to be a very strong coordination mechanism in order to make sense of these pledges. And I come back to that in a second. And secondly, obviously, when it comes to the Syrian victims of the earthquake, yes, they will be helped in their immediate needs: food, shelter, medical supplies, maybe some cash support. There is also willingness of the international community to help with early recovery. For example, if due to the earthquake, a power line is broken, then it can be repaired. If, for example, a water pumping station is broken, it can be repaired. But there would be no build back better in Syria, because the point of view of the European Union and the United States, for example, is that reconstruction in Syria will only be possible once there is a meaningful and sustainable political transition. And this, unfortunately, is not yet the case. So the question is, will this earthquake lead to a political momentum? Will it lead beyond the showing of human and humanitarian solidarity? Will it lead to change in the geopolitical constellations that you have in the Middle East? Let me come back to that in a second. Just before that, to make you aware that the funds that were pledged, for example, the 339 million euros pledged by Team Europe for Syria, and the more than 1.2 billion of grants for Turkey, this is composed of a variety of sources. First, you have Commission funds, and you have obviously the member states of the European Union. Secondly, you have humanitarian aid. I can give you the precise figures there. For Turkey, we pledged about 75 million euros in humanitarian aid, and for Syria, 78 million euros. These are funds that are immediately available. They are under implementation right now. They have been implemented since the first hours of the earthquake, but they are not implemented through government partners. Usually they go through recognized international partners, such as, for example, the World Food Programme or UNICEF, or the Red Crescent, for example, Kizilay in Turkey. They can also go through specialized NGOs that are already active on the ground. And I said there was a fully fledged aid infrastructure, for example, in and around Gaziantep. So this is going on, and this is implemented immediately, but it's not reconstruction. It basically helps people to survive in the first hours, days, and weeks of the earthquake. The second thing would be recovery aid. This can also be made very, very quickly available. And there, of course, you would already seek cooperation with government authorities, especially in Turkey. In Syria, it's a little bit more difficult. Then there are certainly development funds. There it depends on the form of the funding. Is it budget support that would be paid to the Turkish treasury, and then the treasury, the Minister of Finance, would make that available to individual projects? Is it project aid that would be implemented, for example, through the agencies of EU member states like Agence Française du Développement or GIZ in Germany? Or is it any other form of bilateral support, for example, that could be paid to municipalities and so forth? So different forms of funding with different time scales, different duration periods, and sometimes, going through centralized authorities, sometimes not. So it's very, very important to somehow create transparency for that, create coordination, because otherwise there is a danger that pledges are not honored, or that there's double financing for certain issues, or that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing or financing in this case. In particular in Turkey, because there all forms of finance are being used. In Syria, as I said, it's a slightly different scenario because there's a more reduced choice of financial instruments, and coordination instruments are already in place. On the political momentum, I think the ambassador already spoke about what this earthquake could mean for a rapprochement between Turkey and the European Union, so I don't want to add my voice to that. But the interesting question right now is, will this also change something first in the relationship between Syria and the international community, and also between Turkey and Syria? Now, I think there we are entering the world of speculation. But there were one or two immediate impacts. You know, when you deal with aid to Syria, then one of the defining moments every year is the month of July, when in the United Nations Security Council there's a discussion about the extension of the so-called cross-border resolution, which allows aid to enter into the northwest of Syria from Turkey through Bab el-Hawa. And over the past couple of years, obviously, the number of crossing points was reduced to only one. And Russia in particular made it a point that this should be regularly reviewed and possibly at some point phased out, and cross-border aid should be replaced by cross-line aid, whereby the northwest of Syria would be supplied through Damascus. What has happened now after the earthquake are two things. First, just as much as Afad and the Turkish authorities, also the Syrian government in Damascus and the World Food Programme have appealed for international assistance. They have appealed to the European Union to mobilize our civil protection mechanism. And this was honored. Within a couple of days after the earthquake, the European Commission, but also 15 member states and Norway organized the supply of aid material and aid workers into Syria. And we organized an air bridge to Syria. This is the first time in 10 years that we send European planes to Damascus in order to bring medical material, healthcare stuff, obviously, but also food stuff and other material as an immediate emergency aid into Syria. Secondly, very importantly, and without a lot of negotiation and ado, the Syrian government in Damascus gave its consent to the opening of 2 additional border crossing points from Turkey into the northwest. So in addition to Bab el-Hawa, we now have Bab el-Salama and we have Rai, so that aid could come in also more directly to Afrin, to Idlib, and to other parts of northwest Syria. There was no talk about the cross-border resolution in that context. The Syrian authorities gave their consent. Turkey was happy with it. And now these supply routes are used by the international community, by the United Nations in particular. Our friend Faruk mentioned the pledging conference. He mentioned the European Humanitarian Forum. You know, the emergency relief coordinator of the United Nations, Martin Griffiths, was present at both, but he left early. And he left early already on Monday afternoon because he was heading to Damascus. And his objective, of course, was to discuss in Damascus with the Assad authorities how to improve the international aid effort, whether supplies could be channeled directly through Damascus, through the government-held part of Syria, also into the northwest, and whether all this could lead to an improvement of the aid situation, perhaps also capitalizing on the decision of the European Union to ease the sanctions against Syria and to make the implementation of the derogation for humanitarian aid to go into Syria much more easy to implement for banks and for aid operators. This was another political consequence which was tangible relatively quickly after the earthquake, that following the example of the United States and the UK, the European Union as well changed its sanctions regime in order not to, let's say, start a new rapprochement towards the Damascus government, but at least make it easier for aid operators to bring finance, but also equipment into the country. And obviously, much of the equipment that you need in an earthquake situation is dual use. Think of generators, for example. Think of a lot of material that is dual use equipment that could also be used for military purposes. And all this was done, although there are consistent reports about aid dilution and diversion, in particular in the Assad-held part of Syria, where the secret services and other parts of the authorities are suspected basically to benefit indirectly from international forms of aid. Regardless, the community said in this moment we have to stand by the victims, we have to show solidarity, and we want to stretch out our hands. This is where we stand right now. It is too early to call, in my view, to say whether this aid effort in Syria will lead to lasting consequences. In order to do that, I think the Damascus government would have to basically pick up on this and give us signs of goodwill on their side, in particular through a dynamization of their participation in Geir Pedersen's talk on the constitutional amendment in Geneva. That would be a very tangible sign that would open many additional doors. But I'm sure that in the midterm, in the long term, this earthquake will be remembered not only as a devastating disaster for hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, but perhaps also for something which created new political momentum in the Middle East that definitely needs this momentum. Thank you very much, Ceylan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koehler, especially for bringing in the Syrian angle. And before moving on with the questions and answer, I would like to turn back to Ambassador Kaymakcı. In case, Ambassador Kaymakcı, you have some responses to the points made by Dr. Koehler, especially on the points for Turkey-EU relations and Turkey-Syria relations.
No, not really. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes for our questions and answers. And I see that there is one question from the GMF Ankara director. And with this, I would like to remind you that you can type in your questions in the chat box. I will just read out the question from Özgür. And question is addressed to Dr. Koehler. Are there any lessons learned from these earthquakes on international cooperation on disaster response?
A bit difficult to say. You know, I would argue, it sounds a bit cynical, but it's absolutely not meant to be cynical, that this earthquake couldn't have happened in a better area. Why is that so? Turkey, for many years already, is a member of the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. From an EU point of view, and in terms of disaster management, disaster prevention, Turkey is not a third country. Turkey is de facto a member state of the mechanism that the European Union has created 20 years ago in order to pool member states and EU resources and work on disaster management. This mechanism brings together the 27 member states of the European Union, but also 8 additional countries. And Turkey is a member of this for a long time. Being a member means that Turkey regularly takes part in exercises, also organizes exercise itself, where it invites other European disaster management services. And you know, I've been working on the civil protection mechanism for about a year's time. I have seen myself how much of a quality change it brings about if disaster relief services do not go into a country where they have never been before and then first have to establish themselves and learn about the logistics, but you know, go somewhere where they have already trained with others. So AFAD, as a disaster management agency, from our perspective, is not only a partner service, but it is also a very professional service that has stockpiles, that has material. Some of the material it basically keeps ready on behalf of the European Union and not only for Turkey. In that respect, so to say, the level of preparation in Turkey to respond to the disaster's consequence was definitely far better than in many, many other places in the world. Having said that, of course, the sheer dimension of this earthquake and the other afterquakes was so enormous that even the best service in the world would have been totally overwhelmed. I think we have to say this because there's a lot of criticism against AFAD. It may be justified, I don't know, but I think any service anywhere in the world, even in Switzerland or so, would have struggled very, very hard with the sheer consequences of this. Now, still, of course, there are lessons to be learned. But I would say in this particular case that the lessons are in particular are rather enhanced, or are, so to say, continued. We had started already some years ago to, for example, create strategic stockpiles of material that you need in such a situation. And actually, in the case of this earthquake, this paid out. Last week, I was in the United Arab Emirates, and I went to the Dubai logistics city, which is basically a huge warehouse complex. Part of the Dubai logistics city is used by the World Food Programme and also by the European Union. And when the earthquake happened, we were flying in relief material, tents, for example, beds, blankets, medical healthcare material from Dubai to the airports in the south of Turkey. And also, by the way, from Brindisi in the south of Italy, where we have another warehouse complex. So we need to have people ready. We need to have trained people ready. We need to have coordination structures ready, including, for example, communication equipment. But we also need to have the sheer material ready that you need in such a situation to help millions of people to come over the first 2 or 3 very cold nights. That is something which we are building up. Turkey contributes to that, and therefore the response to the earthquake in Turkey was much, much more efficient than in Syria, because in Syria you don't have this. In Syria, of course, you even have a much more complex governance architecture, in the sense that there are areas where you can go if Mr. Assad agrees. There are other areas you can go when the Turkish authorities agree, and there are areas where you can go when Hayat Tahrir al-Sham agrees, which is a terrorist organization. So that has made it very, very difficult. And I'm even more impressed that nevertheless, 15 member states sent material and experts even into Syria, although working conditions there were definitely not easy and not conducive, and definitely not as good as in Turkey.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koehler. Ian just typed in a question in the chat box, and I will share it with both of you, and it's addressed to both of our speakers. Should we think of a regional disaster preparedness measures as a contribution to safety, but also as a contribution to geopolitical stability in the Aegean, Eastern Mediterranean, Levant? Can we start with you, Ambassador Kaymakcı? Büyükelçim, you are on mute.
Yes, actually, I was also planning to say this as addition to what Professor Koehler mentioned. You know, I mean, thanks to this cooperation in Europe, you know, through the EU civil protection mechanism, and thanks to, I think, close cooperation between AFAD and DG ECHO. Just, you know, we have seen that the organization of the Turkish states in their summit decided to create a regional civil protection mechanism. So this is, I think, a very good spillover effect. And as Professor Koehler mentioned, Turkey is a member of the protection mechanism. And for example, during the COVID times, Turkish Airlines really, you know, contributed a lot to bring, you know, European citizens home. But also during the fires in the past, we contributed and we received also a lot of contributions. And as Ian suggests, I think we should have maybe in, you know, as a global, you know, on the global platform, some major coordination centers. Okay, in this part of the world, in Europe, more or less, we have something which is quite well. It can be improved. You know, we can create maybe some fleets, you know, for firefighters. We can create, you know, warehouses, as Professor Koehler mentioned. But also in other parts of the world, if we can create, you know, such centers, I think this will take some of the burden of the rest of Europe. And it might also accelerate the emergency assistance to be provided by the international community.
Thank you, Ambassador Kaymakcı. Dr. Koehler, over
Yeah, Ian, I think we are both old enough to remember the Barcelona process, the start of the Euro-Mediterranean partnership. Now, if over the weekend in your leisure time you pick up your old copy of the Barcelona Declaration in 1995, you will remember that cooperation on disaster prevention and preparedness was already at that time established and invented and in a way endorsed by the foreign ministers of the European Union and all the Mediterranean partner countries, including Turkey and Syria, as a confidence building measure. And actually, even today, there is such cooperation ongoing. We have a project on disaster prevention and preparedness with the Union for the Mediterranean, which brings together, again, experts from all the countries, unfortunately not Syria this time, but certainly Turkey. So there is a lot of cooperation ongoing. The problem is only that if in a concrete disaster situation you want to be operational, you need to have more than just the exchange of training and best practice. You need to have a joint command center. You need to have trained people. You need to have a situation center that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You need to have resources. You need, like the ambassador said, you need to have airlifting capacity and so forth. You are getting rather close to a military style of organization. And that, of course, in a situation that politically is so divided as the Mediterranean is, it is very, very, very challenging. So it's not so much about, creating the technical preparation, the technical steps, and having an exchange between expert services. You need to create structures where somebody has the right to command. Somebody can give instructions. Somebody can mobilize forces, and that is possible in the European Union. In the Mediterranean, once that is possible, you will have peace in the Eastern Mediterranean. It will be an indicator, I think, of peace. Still, I think one should definitely work in this direction, because obviously it's one of these areas where, regardless of where you stand on the dividing line, regardless of what your political position is, everybody says this is something which we need to do. This is something that, when the disaster strikes, basically requires humanitarian intervention without taking a look at the political orientation or the military orientation of the person that is suffering. And therefore, I think, yes, we should invest in this. And the European Union is ready to do so and to offer additional finance to this, that I can say with certainty.
Thank you very much. We have 2 more questions. We don't have enough time, but I will just quickly read out the questions, and then we'll try to get answers like maybe in 2 minutes. First one is, does Turkey need international help in the reconstruction of the buildings, houses, or should it be a local task? If I may, I will address this to Ambassador Kaymakcı. And the second one is for Dr. Koehler. Are there funds designed for local NGOs in Syria, especially in the northwestern Syria? Considering their flexibility and knowledge on the ground, it's important to send aid through local actors. I will appreciate if you can limit your answers to 1 minute, please.
Faruk, could I start, because I have to run away to another video conference, I'm afraid. The answer is yes and no. No, because unfortunately at this moment in time we cannot contract local organizations directly, but yes, we have just issued guidance that obliges our partners, such as the United Nations, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, or, for example, also international NGOs, to work together with local partners and to make sure that at least 1/4 of the money that we give them goes through to local organizations. So there's a lot of indirect cooperation for many years already with certain organizations in the northwest of Syria.
Thank you, Dr. Koehler.
And I say goodbye, many thanks.
You very
Apologies
much
for me running
time.
away so quickly. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I think if I understood the question correctly, I don't know whether it is meant by financial means or technical means. I mean, we underline that the magnitude of this disaster is immense. I think no single country can, easily and quickly overcome, the difficulty caused by the earthquake. So if it is, if the question means financial support, yes, Turkey can do it alone, but it would take more time. So this is why I think international support is important and helpful. If it is a question of techniques, whether we can do it better or not, yes, we can do it. You know, Turkish companies construct almost, you know, I would say 1/4 of the world in many countries they are operating. So the question is the question is standards. I think if we keep up to the standards, we can build quite well. And with the international support, I think we can do it quickly and faster. And I don't see any problem with this, because Turkey and the Turks have been the most generous nation. You know, per capita, if you look at how much Turkey has helped the others, and I think such time of difficulty and disaster, we also deserve, I think, support from our neighbors, from our friends, and you know, from those who would like to contribute to the reconstruction and recovery efforts of the Turkish nation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kaymakcı. It's time for us to conclude, but as promised, I would like to add just a couple of words on the GMF's Hope Fund for Turkey. The fund provides support to the people in Turkey who are impacted by the earthquake through one of our fellows, Marshall Memorial Fellows, Ali Ercan Özgür's initiative, which is called Needs Map. And Needs Map is providing support to those who are in need and bringing them together with those who want to help. And GMS is facilitating this initiative. And we just put in the link to the Hope Fund in the chat box. So feel free to visit the webpage. And if you want to donate, it will be a great help for the people who are affected. And with this, I would like to also highlight the efforts created by my colleague, Kadir Taştan, for managing the TOBB GMF Fellowship on Turkey, Europe, and global issues since 2017. And also, I would like to thank to my colleague, Özgür Hisarcıklıoğlu, who helped us to put together this event. And also to my colleague, Alexandria Chestenede-Geri, for operational support, and of course to you, to our speakers and to our participants, to you, Ambassador Kaymakcı, to Ian, to Mr. Zeytinoğlu. Thank you very much for your invaluable comments and for your time. And with this, I would like to close, and happy Friday. Bye-bye to you all.
Thank you very much. All the best, Ayhan Bey, Ian.
Thank you. I apologize
Ceylan
for
Hanım.
Ian. I couldn't listen to his speech, but I was able to listen to you, Mr. Ambassador. So it was a pleasure. I apologize for my problems, technical problems.
No
here.
problem. We also apologize.
I apologize again for being late to join you all. But it gives me also at the end an opportunity to thank you, Ceylan, for moderating. And
Yes.
wonderful, Ambassador, good to see you. And our thanks to Tove as always.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good evening.